Convicted felon Donald Trump has been found guilty and guilty and guilty and guilty, guilty and guilty, guilty and guilty and guilty, guilty-ish, guilty adjacent, guilty-esque, also guilty and ilty gay, guilty, very guilty, repeatedly guilty, incredibly guilty, extra large guilty, extra crispy guilty, diet guilty, lemon scented guilty, family size guilty, tartar control guilty, and lastly, not guilty. Of course, we knew he was guilty. This was just the legal system confirming it. And before getting to what really matters right now, which is in fact what happens not right now, but next, I would like to observe that no, this was not the legal system finally getting around to confirming that he's guilty. Convicted felon Donald Trump is now 0 for 5 on trial. His corporation guilty of 17 felonies. His first E. Jean Carroll trial, finding him liable for sexual abuse and defamation. His second E. Jean Carroll trial, finding him more guilty for a total of $89 million in liability. He was guilty in his civil fraud case for a total of $355 million in liability. And now 34 felonies, 34-0. Number 34, Shaquille O'Neal, Nolan Ryan, 34, Austin Matthews, and best of all, Herschel Walker. Trump just got Herschel Walkered. 34. And before I stop celebrating, I really need clarification from the millions of Trump cultists who are just as assuredly not stopping, symbolically nailing themselves to crosses right now. Is this Fernando Valenzuela uniform number worth of 34 convictions? Is this the political gift from the Democrats and Biden that assures Trump wins the election, as you all keep saying? Or is it election interference that guarantees he does not win the election, as you idiots also all keep saying? Because this is where I finally get to what's next, and what's next is no, it's neither. What it is potentially just enough, just this, no sentence to jail, no espionage trial, no election subversion trial, no Georgia trial, just this conviction, these convictions. This could cost him 2% of Republican voters. That's where the polling seems to have bottomed out. All of the polling done before the verdict. Did I mention they found him guilty 34 times? It's like 3 convictions per hour of jury deliberation. And yet every news organization has reported or printed or posted that statistic that it could cost him, according to polling, 2%, or maybe more, but 2% of Republican support, as if that meant it was going to cost him like 34 votes. The loss of 2% of Trump's Republican support in the 2020 presidential election would have cost Trump 1,484,480 votes. If the 2% applied evenly to the Electoral College, it would have cost him 5 electoral votes. The loss of 2% of Republican support in the 2016 presidential election would have cost convicted felon Donald Trump 46,000 votes in Michigan. It would have cost him 59,400 votes in Pennsylvania, would have cost him 28,000 votes in Wisconsin. In other words, in 2016, 2% would have cost him Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In other words, 2% would have cost him the 2016 election. And Donald Trump would be a host on News Nation right now. And that math, that 2% math, is conservative because except when speaking about the impact on the Electoral College in 2016, where suddenly 2% means Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin go to Hillary Clinton, except when speaking of that, this does not even address how many of that 2% of Republican voters he loses because of the 34 convictions, how many of those go to Biden? Because if half of them go to Biden, that means the guilty verdicts yesterday just gave the president an additional 3 points in the polling. It's only 2%. Yeah, if the 2% that convicted felon Trump just lost stays home. Now, before you misinterpret my enthusiasms and say, oh, good, that means I can take the summer off and I'll check back in with you on the race in like September. It's not the way it works. That 2% number is as flexible and fluid and unreliable as everything else now in our new unhappy world in which some goddamn son of a bitch turned off all the gravity. Now, this does not mean that 2% will drop to 1% or less. The Marquette Law poll polled on this issue last week. Its overall picture, convicted felon Trump ahead of Biden nationally by 4. Then it asked half of its sample who they would vote for if convicted felon Trump were convicted in the Stormy Daniels case, and they went for Biden by 4. Meaning that the actual swing isn't 2 points against Trump or 3 points for Biden, but 8 points for Biden. I use that 2% figure because it seemed to be closer to something like a consensus figure. And as I think those numbers suggest, it sounds like nothing. It ain't nothing. Of course, if it's 4 points, not 2 points, that's just under 3 million votes it would cost Trump. And if that 8-point swing from this Marquette Law poll could possibly be true, that would mean 5,937,920 more votes for Joe Biden. The media summed up the possible impact on the polls by saying, it's only 2 points. It is much more fixated on the timing of the sentencing, now scheduled for Thursday, July 11th, with the Republican convention, Thug Life 24, opening in Milwaukee on Monday, July 15th. First of all, Trump's defense, the guys who just went 0 for 34, they asked for and will again ask for a delay in sentencing until late July after the convention, and they stand at least a 50-50 chance of getting it because for other felons convicted of this and similar crimes, there would be no really good reason not to grant a delay of 2 weeks in sentencing. Secondly, there is also the chance that Justice Juan Merchan could rationalize no prison time for Trump, even though these are felonies. It has been suggested that the real argument, weighing now in favor of some token sentence like house arrest or weekends in the joint for 3 months, the real argument in favor of that is all of Trump's violations of the gag order. In fact, the DA, Alvin Bragg, who did not just get up at his press conference last night and say, I effing told you so, losers. District Attorney Bragg instead answered a question about the gag orders by referencing the sentencing hearing. And that is a really bad omen for Trump. He didn't say we'll see about that later. He said, well, the sentencing hearing is on July 11th. But again, even if on July 11th or July 25th, Merchan says, I've decided to make an example of Mr. O for 34 over here and sentence him to 40 years in prison, it's not like he's going to be handcuffed on the spot and walked directly to Attica. And yes, by the way, Attica is still open. They got like 2,000 felons in Attica. And the best part of the story of Attica is that all the online info about it mentions the fact that Attica is open 24 hours. Trump cannot appeal the verdict until after the sentence is determined. And then, as we've seen, if he gets a judge he appointed or another crook, he can delay even the hearing until the year 2525. The point of this, beyond the fact that the legal system hasn't finally caught up with him, it is continuing to finally catch up with him, is that just a dent in his support could be enough to decide the election for Biden. One assumes there will now be a flurry of polling, especially in the swing states, as to the impact of the actual verdicts yesterday. If there are enough polls, we might be able to move that consensus number one way or the other, because there is for once a practical reality and a meaning to discussions of the horse race. You and I have known Trump as a crook for at least the last 9 years. As I've mentioned many times, I met him in December 1983, and I knew it then. But for the vast number of Americans who will head to the polls on November 5th, including that 71% of Democrats who know next to nothing about Project 2025, this event is important because it is exactly the kind of concrete event and the breathtaking historical moment they keep hyping on television while the rest of us say, where have you people been since 2015? All it's been has been breathtaking historical moments. I'd like to have a couple of years without any breathtaking goddamn historical moments. Thank you. Because still, for everything else that has changed, it is still one thing for Americans to look at somebody and say, yeah, this guy's corrupt and he's morally bankrupt. But it's something completely different to look at a jury coming back on day 2 of its deliberations, having convicted the son of a bitch of everything. Okay, some other sequelae. 1, Brian Beutler, again, notes that convicted felons are disqualified from getting clearance to receive classified intelligence. Donald Trump is a convicted felon. He's convicted felon Donald Trump. You got to call him that. And Donald Trump, convicted felon, is a convicted felon. The Biden administration now has every right to deny him the customary other candidate intel briefings. And ignoring this law, that is not doing what's fair. It would be ignoring a law instituted for good reason. We don't give our classified intelligence to felons. Look what he did with it before he was a felon. Number 2, the Republican response to felon Trump's convictions is not only not gracious, the early evidence is it's not smart. Yes, they'll raise money off of it. Of course they will. They would have found the money anywhere, anyway. But Larry Hogan, the somehow Republican governor of Maryland, who could easily now become the Republican senator from Maryland and tip the Senate back to the Republicans, writes, regardless of the result, I urge all Americans to respect the verdict and the legal process. At this dangerously divided moment in our history, all leaders, regardless of party, must not pour fuel on the fire with more toxic partisanship. We must reaffirm what has made this nation great, the rule of law. To which Trump's de facto co-campaign chief swiftboat Chris LaCivita writes, you just ended your campaign. Good call, Skeezix. The last thing you want in a Trump dictatorship or a Biden second term, the last thing you want, Chris MFing idiot LaCivita, the last thing you want is a Republican Senate, moron, utter, unabashed, irredeemable moron. Make all the decisions for the campaign, Chris LaCivita. You have the brains of a collar stay. I refer you back to Olbermann's corollary about how democracy survives because of the stupidity of those who seek to destroy it. Chris LaCivita, senior campaign advisor to convicted felon Donald Trump, the Republican nominee for president of jail. And lastly, 3, do not ignore the new tape, which got absolutely buried in the news by the convictions. Former Apprentice producer Bill Pruitt confirms at Slate the literally 2-decade-old rumor that Trump is on tape from that god-awful television show, dropping the N-word on tape. There is a dispute as they film about how to fire an African-American contestant. It's the first show. The routine isn't set. They haven't even really invented the phrase, you're fired yet. And, of course, Trump is a racist nutbag. Why didn't somebody else do the firing? Trump asks, why do I have to do it? Quoting Bill Pruitt, quote, that's not his job, showrunner Jay Beanstalk says to Trump. That's yours. Trump's head continues to bob. I don't think he knew he had the ability to do that. Trump on-air advisor Carolyn Kepcher says. Trump winces again. Yeah, he says to no one in particular, but I mean, would America buy a N-word here winning? Kepcher's pale skin goes bright red. I turn my gaze toward Trump. He continues to wince. He is serious, and he is adamant about not hiring Mr. Jackson. Look, I know, and I knew it within hours, that it was not that we lost our moral way as a nation the day the Access Hollywood tape was revealed and the Republicans did not kick him off the ticket, and people bought his non-apology apology, and everybody who criticized Trump uncriticized him within the year at the absolute latest. We did not lose our way then. What happened was we realized that in 35 to 50% of this country, our way had long since been replaced by something new in which Americans looked for and applauded venality. My online friend Elie Mistal noted, the people who vote for Trump know he uses the N-word. That's why they like him. Elie also jokingly predicted Tim Scott would be using that word by next week. I think he meant it jokingly. And I know that a similar charge, using the N-word in a workplace environment roughly 20 years ago, was just leveled against a Democratic congressman from New Mexico. And worse, when Politico's email newsletter covered both of these stories yesterday, they gave the story of the congressman and the N-word 3 long paragraphs, and the story of Trump and the N-word 2 paragraphs. Well, it's not like it's really news. People baked it in. But I'll circle back to that idea that the Stormy Daniels convictions will only cost Trump 2% of his voters. In 2016, and to a lesser but still sizable degree in 2020, lots of us, and I confess to this freely, I did it, lots of us were looking for some knockout punch that would end Trump's primary candidacy, or his nomination, or his presidency, or his re-election campaign. If you're in the middle of a nightmare, you want to wake up from it immediately. And it could still happen. Who knows? But bluntly, we should stop wasting our time looking for it, looking for a knockout punch. What we should do is keep looking for things that cost him 2% of his support, or 1%, or 0.1%. Because if the damage yesterday from the courtroom turns out to only be not 2%, but 1.5%, but the damage from Trump and the N-word tape is 0.3%, just to choose a random number, guess what? He did not lose 1,485,000 votes yesterday. He lost 1,633,000 votes yesterday. That makes it a good day. Just as important to my mind as the Trump verdicts, this, Chairman Durbin, Senator Whitehouse, this is simple. If Chief Justice John Roberts will not meet voluntarily with you about the corruption on his court, about the perjurers on his court, about the politically active and biased judges on his court, subpoena him. And if Chief Justice John Roberts will not then testify to your Senate Judiciary Committee, arrest him. With every passing minute and every new revelation, the Supreme Court of the United States is losing more and more of its already near fatally low levels of credibility. Like them or loathe them, and obviously I loathe them, but a delegitimized Supreme Court is a bad augur for hopes of holding the constitutional-based government together in the years, maybe decades, of risk that lie ahead of us and would continue to lie ahead of us even if Roberts, Alito, and Thomas resigned today. If you missed this, Durbin and Whitehouse wrote to Roberts a week ago yesterday, long before the latest version of the latest Alito scandal, just the latest of the latest Supreme Court scandals, and they asked Roberts to meet with them, not asking for his testimony, not asking for him to swear himself in, not asking for his resignation, not asking for his papers, just meet. Yesterday came his reply, in which he, in short, declares himself and Alito and Thomas and the other conservatives, the kings and queens of the United States for life, answerable to no one. I quote, "I must respectfully decline your request for a meeting. As noted in my letter to Chairman Durbin last April, apart from ceremonial events, only on rare occasions in our nation's history has a sitting Chief Justice met with legislators, even in a public setting, such as a committee hearing, with members of both political parties present. Separation of powers, concerns, and the importance of preserving judicial independence counsel against such appearances. Moreover, the format proposed, a meeting with leaders of only one party who have expressed an interest in matters currently pending before the court, simply underscores that participating in such a meeting would be inadvisable." John Roberts is hiding behind judicial independence that he, and especially Alito and Thomas, long since forfeited, long since whored away. And in Clarence Thomas's case, that is meant literally. Clarence Thomas is a whore. And Roberts' invoking of separation of powers in this context shows how little meaning that phrase has for him or the others, and that they do not know why the separation of powers was created by the framers of the Constitution. The powers are separate. The goal of those intended to wield those powers is meant to be one goal. If there is an imbalance somewhere, the men who wield that power were always meant to interact and to try to resolve and to try to compromise for the greater good of the United States of America, as corny and as perhaps impossible as that seems in the context of what we saw in a New York courtroom yesterday. Roberts' answer to this naive but at least well-intentioned invitation from Durbin and White House is a dignified, gussied up, "F you, commoners, try and make me show up." Conservatism as a reactionary movement dedicated against liberty began to assert itself in the 1950s and spurted out briefly with Barry Goldwater and to some degree, although his corruption truly transcended any particular brand of politics, with Richard Nixon. But it stuck with Ronald effing Reagan, and it became a cult with Ronald Reagan. And John Roberts was a Reagan White House law office flunky. And Sam Alito was in the Reagan Department of Justice. And Clarence Thomas was, in what must be seen in retrospect as an utter irony, Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at Reagan's Department of Education. The man who's trying to undo Brown v. Board of Education. The parts of this Supreme Court, this illegitimate Supreme theocratic court under John Roberts, the parts of it that are not Trump are all Ronald Reagan, still effing with us from beyond the grave. The surviving dregs of Reaganism are outdated in this country by decades. These men entered into politics and government, corrupt and backwards looking on day one, animated as Reagan was by the ends justifying the means, and in the ensuing 40-plus years, they have only gotten worse. They have been here so long, so tirelessly in their devotion to pushing back the future, that they have been mistaken for the system, the establishment. And in anything approaching a democracy, the system eventually becomes self-protecting. Which brings us back to Dick Durbin and his response to the Alito crisis, and the shadow version of this nightmare of one of the major parties running a convicted felon, a 34 times convicted felon, as its candidate in a presidential election is the reality, the not unconnected reality, that a Supreme Court compromised in a base and shabby way not seen since before the Civil War, a Supreme Court may ultimately decide that presidential election in which one of the parties is running a convicted felon. This cannot stand. At least half of us, at least our side of this, we have wished it would never come to this. We may, in fact, have been guilty of living in denial about it eventually coming to this. But one way or the other, this nation in the years and decades to come is going to undergo sweeping, basic change, perhaps on the scale seen between the time before the Civil War and the time after the Civil War. As Lincoln once said about slavery, it will become all one thing or all the other. We will become a nation, a flawed but honorable sort of democracy that works for most of its people, that intends to do good most of the time in the world, or we will become an authoritarian state sharing the spoils of a dying planet with the Russians. But whichever way, it will change. And change is the enemy of a self-protecting system. And Dick Durbin is so deeply inside the self-protecting system that he does not want to take a step, no matter how essential, that would shatter precedents or set new ones. The essence of self-protection is never having to face anything new. You don't subpoena the Chief Justice of the United States because, well, they didn't subpoena Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, did they? Therefore, when the day comes that the Chief Justice is corrupt, is politically compromised, is convinced he is an unelected king of America, you will let him get away with it. We cannot let this happen. Change will come to this country, and it will come violently, and I hope I mean the word violently as a metaphor, but bluntly, my hope that I do mean it that way changes every couple days. Much of what we know about this nation will change, and it is up to us, it is right now up to people like Senator Durbin of Illinois to decide whether the change will liberate this nation and increase its freedom for its people and increase the civic responsibility and probity of its servants, like Chief Justices and Senate Judiciary chairs, whether it will do that or whether it will permit the crooks, like John Roberts and Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito and Donald Trump, to enslave the rest of us, because the Dick Durbins feared what would happen if they stopped obeying and protecting the self-protecting system. Senator, if Chief Justice Roberts will not talk to you, subpoena him. If he will not appear before your committee, arrest him. The only part of the self-protecting system that needs to be protected is the premise that we are a nation of laws and not of men. And if you said that to John Roberts after that answer to that question in that letter, it is clear now that bluntly, John Roberts would have no goddamned idea what the hell you were talking about. Also of interest here, say, we know what happened to Kristi Noem's dog. We think we know what happened to Kristi Noem's national political career. What the hell happened to the thing that started all this trouble? Kristi Noem's book. The sales numbers are in, and bluntly, I am not believing what I am seeing, in large part because what I am seeing here in those sales numbers is so small that I feel like I need a new pair of glasses. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Still ahead of us on this edition of Countdown, well, after Trump was found guilty. Okay, I'm not doing that again. But after it happened, there is only one story to read on this Friday with James Thurber, the one in which Thurber all but prophesied Trump a scant 85 years before his election and happily also prophesied Trump's fall. Coming up on Fridays with Thurber. But first, as ever, there are still new idiots, more brand new idiots to talk about. The daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The runner-up worse, Clay Travis, right-wing nutjob sports wannabe, turned right-wing nutjob political wannabe. He's gone after co-host Sunny Hostin of The View by way of the new women's basketball star Caitlin Clark. To quote Clay Travis, right-wing nutjob, Caitlin Clark's race and her gender are not the reasons that she's popular. They had nothing to do with her becoming the NCAA scoring champion. In fact, regardless of what race Caitlin Clark was, regardless of her sexuality, she would still be employed in the WNBA. She could be the ugliest person on the planet, Clay Travis says. Her game still translates. Her race doesn't matter. Okay? Can Sunny Hostin say the same thing? Sunny Hostin, to my knowledge, rarely, if ever, says anything smart. I do think she's pretty, and she's a minority. If Sunny Hostin were an ugly, fat, white woman, she would have no media career whatsoever if she had the exact same opinions as she does now. Think about that, says Clay Travis. Sunny Hostin, you are an ugly, fat woman. You have no media career. Unlike Caitlin Clark, who, regardless of her race or her sexuality, would be employed in the WNBA. Frankly, we can debate some of that. If Sunny Hostin wasn't pretty and a minority, she would have no media career whatsoever. If she were unattractive and white, there's a 0% chance she would be on The View, unquote, Clay Travis. Well, obviously, Clay Travis is a no-talent racist, but his construction here has some merit if you, in fact, pull it out of this equation and apply it instead to him, Clay Travis. Intellectually, Clay Travis is now what we politely call challenged. And if he were not fulfilling that niche, he would have no media career whatsoever. The runner-up worser, speaking of sports, there's Royce White, who 4 years ago right now was one of the leaders of the George Floyd protests in Minnesota and then decided he should become the Republican senator from that state. And he has, in those 4 years, gone totally fascist. And he was endorsed by the state Republican Party, even though the National Republican Senatorial Commission doesn't want anything to do with them, and here's why. Because he does the traditional African-American self-debasement to become accepted by the white fascists, you know, the Tim Scott ploy, only with lots of online swearing that even Tim Scott would not think of. I can't say that. NBC News is now citing documents showing that White, quote, was ordered to catch up after he fell behind on court-mandated child support payments. At least a half a dozen times from 2020 to 2023, court filings in 2 cases show. White, a father of 4, was twice found in contempt of court over the findings, one of them in a Minnesota county where he remains in constructive contempt, facing the ongoing threat of a 180-day jail sentence should he again fail to keep up with the payments. The next hearing in that case is set for October 21st, 2 weeks before the election. White's response, quote, talk about some real issues, White said in the interview. A lot of people have child support. A lot of people have alimony. A lot of people have back child support. All you liberals really just want to shame people with kids because you're anti-human as F, unquote. The best part of Royce White's campaign is that he is in large part running on the fact that he is, as even this NBC article notes, quote, Royce White, a former NBA player, National Basketball Association. Well, sir, Royce White's NBA career lasted 8 minutes and 55 seconds. 8 minutes and 55 seconds. That's how long he played for the 2014 Sacramento Kings. He played 56 seconds in the March 21st game against San Antonio, 49 seconds on March 23rd against Milwaukee, and a whopping 7 minutes and 10 seconds on March 26th against New York. Royce White scored no points. Royce White had no rebounds. Royce White made no free throws. Royce White made no assists, and Royce White took 1 shot, which he missed. In other words, Royce White's NBA career is exactly 8 minutes and 55 seconds longer than yours was. And you scored as many points as he did. But our winner here is Kristi Noem, the worst. It's hard to say what her boast in her new book, that she murdered her daughter's puppy because she failed to train it properly, what that's done to her political career. But we know what it has done to the book. In its first week, with all the pre-sales and the bulk book orders coming through, Kristi Noem's No Going Back, good call on the title, No Going Back sold 21,981 copies in this country. Pretty good. In fact, about average for right-wing indoctrination books. Week 2, with news of the murder and the disastrous book tour just beginning to sink in, nearly a 50% drop-off. Noem sold 11,000 copies in Week 2. Week 3, make or break week for any book, May 19th through May 25th, Kristi Noem's book, that she might as well have renamed it I Kill Puppies. Kristi Noem's book sold nationwide in a week 237 copies. 237? 2, a 3, and a 7? Nearly 22,000 copies in week 1, 237 in week 3. As one editor put it, it's the most dramatic drop-off in sales he's seen in 30 years in the business. And if you want the jaw-dropping statistic to go with that assertion, that drop-off from week 1 sales to week 3 sales is a mere 9,275%. And we don't even know what the totals are for returns of people who bought the book and said, I don't want it in my house. Kristi, hey, what about those movie rights? Have you sold the movie rights yet? Noem, today's worst author in the world! To the Master, the work of James Thurber. There is a short film of this story. I don't think it really does it justice. I don't think anything does it justice. Occasionally, real life does do it justice. I've thought I've seen this story playing out in real time in this country almost every day for about 7 years. Sit back and relax, if relax is the right word for it. For The Greatest Man in the World by James Thurber. Looking back on it now from the vantage point of 1940, one can only marvel that it had not happened long before it did. The United States of America had been, ever since Kitty Hawk, blindly constructing the elaborate petard by which sooner or later it must be hoist. It was inevitable that someday there would come roaring out of the skies a national hero of insufficient intelligence, background, and character successfully to endure the mounting orgies of glory prepared for aviators who stayed up for a long time or flew a great distance. Both Lindbergh and Byrd, fortunately for national decorum and international amity, had been gentlemen. So had our other famous aviators. They wore their laurels gracefully, withstood the awful weather of publicity, married excellent women, usually fine family, and quietly retired to private life and the enjoyment of their varying fortunes. No untoward incidents on a worldwide scale marred the perfection of their conduct on the perilous heights of fame. The exception to the rule was, however, bound to occur, and it did. In July 1937, when Jack Pal Smirch, erstwhile mechanic's helper, in a small garage in Westfield, Iowa, flew a second-hand, single-motored, Breasthaven Dragonfly 3 monoplane all the way around the world without stopping. Never before in the history of aviation had such a flight as Smirch's even been dreamed of. No one had even taken seriously the weird floating auxiliary gas tanks, invention of the mad New Hampshire professor of astronomy, Dr. Charles Lewis Gresham, upon which Smirch placed full reliance. When the garage worker, a slightly built, surly, unprepossessing young man of 22, appeared at Roosevelt Field early in July 1937, slowly chewing a great quid of scrap tobacco, and announced, "Nobody ain't seen no flying yet." The newspapers touched briefly and satirically upon his projected 25,000-mile flight. Aeronautical and automotive experts dismissed the idea curtly, implying that it was a hoax, a publicity stunt. The rusty, battered, second-hand plane wouldn't go. The Gresham auxiliary tanks wouldn't work. It was simply a cheap joke. Smirch, however, after calling on a girl in Brooklyn who worked in the flap-folding department of a large paper box factory, a girl whom he later described as his sweet patootie, climbed nonchalantly into his ridiculous plane at dawn of the memorable 7th of July, 1937, spit a curve of tobacco juice into the still air, and took off, carrying with him only a gallon of bootleg gin and 6 pounds of salami. When the garage boy thundered out over the ocean, the papers were forced to record in all seriousness that a mad, unknown young man, his name was variously misspelled, had actually set out upon a preposterous attempt to span the world in a rickety one-engine contraption, trusting to the long-distance refueling device of a crazy schoolmaster. When 9 days later, without having stopped once, the tiny plane appeared above San Francisco Bay, headed for New York, spluttering and choking to be sure, but still magnificently and miraculously aloft, the headlines, which long since had crowded everything else off the front page, even the shooting of the governor of Illinois by the Valetti gang, swelled to unprecedented size, and the news stories began to run to 25 and 30 columns. It was noticeable, however, that the accounts of the epoch-making flight touched rather lightly upon the aviator himself. This was not because the facts about the hero as a man were too meager, but because they were too complete. Reporters who had been rushed out to Iowa when Smirch's plane was first sighted over the little French coast town of Cergy-le-Maire to dig up the story of the great man's life had promptly discovered that the story of his life could not be printed. His mother, a sullen short-order cook in a shack restaurant on the edge of a tourist's camping ground near Westfield, met all inquiries as to her son with an angry, the hell with him, I hope he drowns." His father appeared to be in jail somewhere for stealing spotlights and lap robes from tourists' automobiles. His young brother, a weak-minded lad, had but recently escaped from the Preston, Iowa reformatory and was already wanted in several western towns for the theft of money order blanks from post offices. These alarming discoveries were still piling up at the very time that Pal Smirch, the greatest hero of the 20th century, blear-eyed, dead for sleep, half-starved, was piloting his crazy junk heap high above the region in which the lamentable story of his private life was being unearthed, headed for New York and a greater glory than any man of his time had ever known. The necessity for printing some account in the papers of the young man's career and personality had led to a remarkable predicament. It was, of course, impossible to reveal the facts, for a tremendous popular feeling in favor of the young hero had sprung up like a grass fire when he was halfway across Europe on his flight around the globe. He was, therefore, described as a modest chap, taciturn, blonde, popular with his friends, popular with girls. The only available snapshot of Smirch, taken at the wheel of a phony automobile in a cheap photo studio at an amusement park, was touched up so that the little vulgarian looked quite handsome. His twisted leer was smoothed into a pleasant smile. The truth was, in this way, kept from the youth's ecstatic compatriots. They did not dream that the Smirch family was despised and feared by its neighbors in the obscure Iowa town, nor that the hero himself, because of numerous unsavory exploits, had come to be regarded in Westfield as a nuisance and a menace. Pal Smirch had, the reporters discovered, once knifed the principal of his high school. Not mortally, to be sure, but he had knifed him. And on another occasion, surprised in the act of stealing an altar cloth from a church, he had bashed the sexton over the head with a pot of Easter lilies. For each of these offenses, he had served a sentence in the reformatory. Inwardly, the authorities, both in New York and in Washington, prayed that an understanding Providence might, however awful such a thing seemed, bring disaster to the rusty, battered plane and its illustrious pilot, whose unheard-of flight had aroused the civilized world to hosannas of hysterical praise. The authorities were convinced that the character of the renowned aviator was such that the limelight of adulation was bound to reveal him to all the world as a congenital hooligan, mentally and morally unequipped to cope with his own prodigious fame. "I trust," said the Secretary of State at one of the many secret cabinet meetings called to consider the national dilemma, "I trust that his mother's prayer will be answered," by which he referred to Mrs. Emma Smirch's wish that her son might be drowned. It was, however, too late for that. Smirch had leaped the Atlantic and then the Pacific as if they were mill ponds. At 3 minutes after 2 o'clock on the afternoon of July 17th, 1937, the garage boy brought his idiotic plane into Roosevelt Field for a perfect three-point landing. It had, of course, been out of the question to arrange a modest little reception for the greatest flyer in the history of the world. He was received at Roosevelt Field with such elaborate and pretentious ceremonies as rocked the world. Fortunately, however, the worn and spent hero promptly swooned, had to be removed bodily from his plane, and was spirited from the field without having opened his mouth once. Thus, he did not jeopardize the dignity of his first reception, a reception illumined by the presence of the Secretaries of War and the Navy, Mayor Michael J. Moriarty of New York, the Premier of Canada, Governors Fanaman, Groves, McFeely, and Critchfield, and a brilliant array of European diplomats. Smirch did not, in fact, come to in time to take part in the gigantic hullabaloo arranged at City Hall for the next day. He was rushed to a secluded nursing home and confined in bed. It was 9 days before he was able to get up, or to be more exact, before he was permitted to get up. Meanwhile, the greatest minds in the country in solemn assembly had arranged a secret conference of city, state, and government officials, which Smirch was to attend for the purpose of being instructed in the ethics and behavior of heroism. On the day that the little mechanic was finally allowed to get up and dress, and for the first time in 2 weeks took a great chew of tobacco, he was permitted to receive the newspaper men, this by way of testing him out. Smirch did not wait for questions. "Yous guys," he said, and the Times man winced. "Yous guys can tell the cockeyed world that I put it over on Lindbergh, see? Yeah, made an ass of them two frogs." The two frogs was a reference to a pair of gallant French flyers who, in attempting a flight only halfway around the world, had 2 weeks before unhappily been lost at sea. The Times man was bold enough at this point to sketch out for Smirch the accepted formula for interviews in cases of this kind. He explained that there should be no arrogant statements belittling the achievements of other heroes, particularly heroes of foreign nations. "To hell with that," said Smirch. "I did it, see? I did it, and I'm talking about it." And he did talk about it. None of this extraordinary interview was, of course, printed. On the contrary, the newspapers, already under the disciplined direction of a secret directorate created for the occasion and composed of statesmen and editors, gave out to a panting and restless world that Jackie, as he had been arbitrarily nicknamed, would consent to say only that he was very happy and that anyone could have done what he did. "My achievement has been, I fear, slightly exaggerated," the Times man's article had him protest with a modest smile. These newspaper stories were kept from the hero, a restriction which did not serve to abate the rising malevolence of his temper. The situation was indeed extremely grave, for pal Smirch was, as he kept insisting, rarin' to go. He could not much longer be kept from a nation clamorous to lionize him. It was the most desperate crisis the United States of America had faced since the sinking of the Lusitania. On the afternoon of the 27th of July, Smirch was spirited away to a conference room in which were gathered mayors, governors, government officials, behaviorist psychologists, and editors. He gave them each a limp, moist paw and a brief, unlovely grin. "Hiya," he said. When Smirch was seated, the mayor of New York arose and, with obvious pessimism, attempted to explain what he must say and how he must act when presented to the world, ending his talk with a high tribute to the hero's courage and integrity. The mayor was followed by Governor Fetterman of New York, who, after a touching declaration of faith, introduced Cameron Spottiswoode, second secretary of the American Embassy in Paris, the gentleman selected to coach Smirch in the amenities of public ceremonies. Sitting in a chair with a soiled yellow tie in his hand and his shirt open at the throat, unshaved, smoking a rolled cigarette, Jack Smirch listened with a leer on his lips. I get you, he cut in nastily. You want me to act like a softy, huh? You want me to act like that mebbity baby face Lindbergh, huh? Well, nuts to that, see? Everyone took in his breath sharply. It was a sigh and a hiss. Mr. Lindbergh, began a United States senator, purple with rage, and Mr. Byrd, Smirch, who was paring his nails with a jackknife, cut in again. Boyd, he exclaimed. For God's sake, that big... Somebody shut off the blasphemies with a sharp word. A newcomer had entered the room. Everyone stood up except Smirch, who was still busy with his nails, and he did not even glance up. Mr. Smirch, said someone sternly, the President of the United States. It had been thought that the presence of the chief executive might have a chastening effect on the young hero, and the former had been, thanks to the remarkable cooperation of the press, secretly brought to the obscure conference room. A great, painful silence fell. Smirch looked up, waved a hand at the president. How you coming? He asked, and began rolling a fresh cigarette. The silence deepened. Someone coughed in a strained way. Geez, it's hot, ain't it? Said Smirch. He loosened 2 more shirt buttons, revealing a hairy chest and the tattooed word Sadie enclosed in a stenciled heart. The great and important men in the room, faced by the most serious crisis in American history, exchanged worried frowns. Nobody seemed to know how to proceed. Come on, said Smirch. Let's get the hell out of here. When do I start cutting in on the parties, huh? And when is there gonna be this in it? He rubbed a thumb and forefinger together meaningly. Money? Exclaimed a state senator, shocked, pale. Yeah, money, said Pal, flipping his cigarette out of the window. And big money. He began rolling a fresh cigarette. Big money, he repeated, frowning over the rice paper. He tilted back in his chair and leered at each gentleman separately. The leer of an animal that knows its power. The leer of a leopard loose in a bird and dog shop. For God's sake, let's get someplace where it's cooler, he said. I've been cooped up plenty for 3 weeks. Smirch stood up and walked over to an open window, where he stood staring down into the street 9 floors below. The faint shouting of newsboys floated up to him. He made out his name. Hot dog, he cried, grinning, ecstatic. He leaned out over the sill. You tell 'em, babies, he shouted down. Hot diggity dog! In the tense little knot of men standing behind him, a quick, mad impulse flared up. An unspoken word of appeal, of command, seemed to ring through the room, yet it was deadly silent. Charles K. L. Brand, secretary to the mayor of New York City, happened to be standing nearest Smirch. He looked inquiringly at the President of the United States. The President, pale, grim, nodded shortly. Brand, a tall, powerfully built man, once a tackle at Rutgers University, stepped forward, seized the greatest man in the world by his left shoulder and the seat of his pants, and pushed him out the window. My God, he's fallen out the window! cried a quick-witted editor. "Get me out of here," cried the president. Several men sprang to his side, and he was hurriedly escorted out of a door toward a side entrance of the building. The editor of the Associated Press took charge, being used to such things. Crisply, he ordered certain men to leave, others to stay. Quickly, he outlined a story which all the papers were to agree on, sent 2 men to the street to handle that end of the tragedy, commanded a senator to sob, and 2 congressmen to go to pieces nervously. In a word, he skillfully set the stage for the gigantic task that was to follow, the task of breaking to a grief-stricken world the sad story of the untimely, accidental death of its most illustrious and spectacular figure. The funeral was, as you know, the most elaborate, the finest, the solemnest, and the saddest ever held in the United States of America. The monument in Arlington Cemetery, with its clean white shaft of marble and the simple device of a tiny plane carved on its base, is a place for pilgrims in deep reverence to visit. The nations of the world paid lofty tributes to little Jackie Smirch, America's greatest hero. At a given hour, there were 2 minutes of silence throughout the nation. Even the inhabitants of the small, bewildered town of Westfield, Iowa, observed this touching ceremony. Agents of the Department of Justice saw to that. One of them was especially assigned to stand grimly in the doorway of a little shack restaurant on the edge of the tourists' camping ground just outside the town. There, under his stern scrutiny, Mrs. Emma Smirch bowed her head over 2 hamburger steaks sizzling on her grill, bowed her head and turned away so that the Secret Service man could not see the twisted, strangely familiar leer on her lips. The Greatest Man in the World by James Thurber. How could he have known? I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, the bass, and the drums. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. Our announcer today was my friend Stevie Van Zandt, and everything else was pretty much my fault. So that's Countdown for this, the 160th day until the 2024 presidential election, the 1,241st day since convicted felon Donald Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the July 11th sentencing hearing, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if it happens, use the not regularly given elector objection option to stop him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is Tuesday. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.